Hi friends, it's Kayla. Sorry for the delay in content this week. I am filming like a big long vlog for January, and also every time I sat down to film this week, the sun has eluded me. So we're doing our best with what we have today. I got asked recently if I could do in my like list of favorites that I've been doing on Instagram, if I could do a list of favorite audiobooks. And I thought that was a great idea because it's been 2 years since I did a video where I recommended audiobooks. I think I gave you like 20 or 30 and provided little like samples of what the audiobooks sounded like. And it's funny because looking back on that video, there's definitely audiobooks that are a little like basic that it's funny looking back that I included, when I feel like over the past 2 years I've gotten more picky with the audiobooks that I enjoy. I've actually discovered a lot of audiobooks that I've like hated the last couple years. I think we can definitively say there has been a rise in audiobooks over the last couple years, when it used to feel like a bonus, like a nice little surprise when you would find out a book had an audiobook. Nowadays it's almost strange to look up an audiobook for something and find that there isn't one. So naturally, having consumed more audiobooks than ever over the last couple years, I have ones that I like, ones that I don't like, and I wanted to give you 10 to 15 that if you're interested in the book, I would recommend enjoying it via audio. If you enjoy audiobooks, that is. I don't think there's any book that I have consumed fully via audio. It's usually a mix, but with the combination of having Libro.fm Scribd and Libby, like it's easy to just listen to some of an audiobook and not feel like I didn't get my money's worth if I'm also reading part of it physically. So I'm going to go over a couple different genres, and maybe there will be something in here for you. If you've watched all of my content the last couple years, you've already heard of all of these books. So I'm going to start with Biased. This is a book about bias, hidden prejudice. It's written by Jennifer L. Eberhardt, PhD, and the audiobook is narrated by her. The other two nonfictions I have aren't narrated by the author, so this isn't like a definitive thing that I'm saying, but I do tend to prefer nonfiction when it's narrated by the author. There's just a certain authenticity I feel like you can hear when someone is clearly using their own words and like knows what they're talking about. So let me play a little sample.
For the first time in my career, I was facing a hostile crowd. There was no booing or yelling. There were no verbal complaints of any kind. Just a steely silence that was more eloquent than any words. Finally, I caught the eye of LaRon Armstrong, a captain whom I'd worked with before on trainings designed to improve police-community relations.
It's so weird listening to them on like regular speed, because I traditionally will listen on like 1.8 to 2, because that's typically how fast I would read it with my eyes. But that gave you a good example of what she's talking about, which is police training. A big part of her life and her career is with law enforcement, and she discusses like personal experiences that she has had, stories from other people, facts and statistics, and what it's like doing bias training. There's a lot to learn. It's really fascinating, and that's my first recommendation. My next one is Disfigured by Amanda Leduc. Speaking about learning things, this is about disability within fairy tales and representation. The audiobook is narrated by Amanda Barker, and it's a lot of personal anecdotes and also opinion-based stuff about fairy tales and mythology.
A princess in a wheelchair would have trouble finding those blackberries, I thought as I crept through the bushes. And then I stopped briefly and smiled. A princess in a wheelchair? Who ever heard of such a thing? But by the time I reached the blackberry bush, that unknown princess in her wheelchair was all I could think about. That princess and the 7 dwarfs who helped Snow White, and Rumpelstiltskin, and the ugliness of the Beast in Beauty and the Beast, the evil queen in Snow White, who transforms herself into a hunchbacked old woman.
Since Amanda Leduc goes through her childhood and growing up and the things that she experienced and saw in media, I think the narrator does a really great job of embodying that like innocent perspective. Just the quality of her voice really lends itself well to the type of storytelling that's in here, and I really enjoyed listening to it. My last one is Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay. I gave this 5 stars. I think it's a fantastic book, whether you want to read it eyes or ears. But it is narrated by my favorite narrator, Bonnie Turpin. And it's so interesting because before this, I had only listened to her narrate like horror or fantasy, and I never would have pegged her as a nonfiction narrator. So when I picked this up, it was really cool to listen to her narrate something completely different and seeing how she changes the cadence of her voice depending on what she's narrating.
Because our feminist leaders have failed us. We forget the difference between feminism and professional feminists. I openly embrace the label of bad feminist. I do so because I am flawed and human. I am not terribly well versed in feminist history. I am not as well read in key feminist texts as I would like to be. I have certain interests and personality traits and opinions that may not fall in line with mainstream feminism.
It's funny though, listening to an audiobook narrator that you're so used to, and it starts to feel like it's Bonnie Turpin. Like these are Bonnie Turpin's opinions. But this is one of my favorite books on feminism. It critiques a lot of media. Roxane Gay is just such a passionate writer, and everything that she's trying to convey really comes through, even though she didn't narrate it herself. She talks about her own journey with feminism, misconceptions, flaws within it, and it's very like quick chapters that have a clear theme and intent with them, and this is just a great book. The audiobook I would recommend. Speaking of Bonnie Turpin, I'm gonna go to her next thing so we can listen to like a difference in style, because I have found quite a few horror books over the last couple years that I've really enjoyed on audio, which is just so awesome because I used to almost exclusively do fantasy and sci-fi on audio, because for me it was like listening to just this fantastical story, and that's what was cool about audiobooks. But I've come to enjoy contemporary fiction, mystery thrillers, and horror more lately. So one of my top recommendations is the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. This was a 4-star book for me. All of the books here, are 4 and 5 stars. And this is exactly what it sounds like. It's a book club, a bunch of women in the neighborhood get together, they talk about books, and then a man enters the situation and some people think he's a vampire.
You've seen these women. They meet for lunch and laugh loudly enough for everyone in the restaurant to hear. They get silly after a single glass of wine. Their idea of living on the edge is to buy a pair of Christmas earrings that light up. They agonize far too long over whether or not to order dessert. As respectable individuals, their names will appear in the paper only 3 times: when they're born, when they get married, and when they die.
Okay, so that is just the intro. I'm getting the samples off of like Scribd or Audible, and as the story picks up and more personalities are introduced, there's naturally a lot more personality to the way that she's narrating, and it was just really fun to listen to. Another horror I really enjoyed is Come For Me With Apples by Catherine M. Valenti, and this is such a short audiobook. It's only 2 hours, and I did enjoy it reading it both ways. And this is when I know that it's like hard to justify an audiobook if it's in like a membership type scenario where 1 credit could mean a 700-page book or a 100-page book, and it's hard to justify it. So that's when I really recommend checking with your library, like the Overdrive or Libby app, or using Scribd, which isn't my favorite audiobook service now, but it is valuable, and I have a monthly subscription again, because you can read a bunch of short books for that 1 monthly membership price, which there are flaws with, absolutely. This is by no means a battle of the audiobook app conversation, but this is narrated by Karis Campbell, and the story itself is like a neighborhood that's just perfect, and everyone in it is perfect, and nobody ever has any issues, and it's almost like a robotic Stepford Wives vibe, and you don't really know what's going on from the beginning, and neither does the main character. And so I feel like the narration has a very cold, calm style to it, and I recommend listening to this on regular speed if you traditionally listen a little faster, just because you really get the tone and the vibe. And if you're somebody who isn't traditionally scared or unsettled by horror books, I think that audiobooks help with that for me. If the narrator is doing a great job, they add like this chilling tone to the whole thing.
And sunlight and sparrow song, and the softness of green shadows in a house that is far too big for her. Not that she complains. Oh, no, never, not Sophia, in whom the organ of dissatisfaction was somehow absent from birth. Her husband spoils her, and she is grateful. Sophia runs her hand over the place beside her where her husband so rarely sleeps these days, and thinks it again with as much joy. I was made for him.
This is one of my favorite horror novellas, so I'm trying really hard not to give the whole thing away, but I did do an entire spoiler-filled vlog, just in case you're interested after you read it. Speaking of short horror, let's move on to the next one, which is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. If you're somebody who struggles like me sometimes to really get a feel for the tone of a book, I feel like narrators really help establish like what the main character sounds like, what their vibe is. So this one comes in at 5 hours. It's narrated by Abby Craden. It's from the perspective of Dracula's bride, and it's written in letters to, well, he's unnamed, but it's Dracula.
I wonder if you would have wanted me if you found me like that, vibrant and loved and alive. But you found me alone, my lord, beaten down to a shadow of my former self and very near death. It was as though fate had laid me out for you, an irresistible banquet of promise, you would say, of potential.
I've just really come to appreciate the art of storytelling and creating an audiobook. I feel like 5 years ago when I listened to an audiobook, it was just somebody who was talented at pronouncing things and, I don't know, could read well. But now when I listen to audiobooks, there are so many times that I'm like, oh wow, this person was like perfectly cast. There was a specific thing that they were looking for, that they wanted the audiobook to sound like. And this person is meant to portray a certain vibe, when I just don't feel like that's what I was thinking about when I was listening to audiobooks years ago. So I feel like you're either really into these styles or maybe you're not, and you like to come up with your own kind of voice in your head for the characters. But for me, it really helped me feel the characters' emotions in this abusive relationship, in this unhealthy power dynamic. He's bringing other people into their marriage, and now she's writing letters to him in the past, and we're learning about their life together. And the audiobook only improved my experience with this. So, highly recommend. Another horror, let's see. Oh, I don't have the last horror, but I'll put it right here. It's called When the Reckoning Comes by LaTanya McQueen. This story is about a group of friends. Something happened to them when they were younger, and now they've had a bit of a falling out, and they're coming back together. One of them is having a wedding on a plantation. The narrator is Carrie Young, and I think she did a great job of embodying all of these different characters. They're all so different, and there's a lot of times where I listen to an audiobook, and if it's, you know, a woman and she's voicing a man, I don't love it. And when it's a man voicing a woman, like there's certain voice actors who it's not that they don't do it well, because I'm not the one to say if someone is doing something well, like I don't know, but it's just not something that I particularly enjoy. And I think she balanced it really well. And then also there are the voices of all of the enslaved people, the ghosts who are haunting the area. It's a really slow burn kind of book, and it gets very creepy, and I think she only adds to that tension.
How long did you think after all of this it would be before their souls finally came for you in the night? These men and women remember. They remember the sight of their husbands and sons.
Also, obviously, if you're reading a dialect you're unfamiliar with, or you don't know if the characters are supposed to have a certain accent, or you've never heard an accent before from where the book takes place, the audiobook is always so helpful to give you that authentic experience. Okay, switching genres, like I said before, fantasy sci-fi used to be the genre I would pick up the most if I wanted to listen to it. So I picked 3 that I really enjoyed. These first 2 I feel like we can call fantasy light. So like there is a lot of realistic stuff happening, but there's a little bit of weirdness or magic. One of my favorite books of the year was Mrs. Death by Selena Godin, and she herself actually narrates the audiobook. I think This one and the sci-fi one are only available on Audible. I just think it's very cool because I don't hear a lot of authors outside of nonfiction narrating their own stories. I definitely have listened to a few, like I know Kweke Emezi has done a couple I've listened to. But this is one of those books, like the last time I did this video, I talked about this with Split Tooth, which is a book that I feel like is equally impactful if you read it physically or audibly. So I would recommend actually doing both, and I read it both ways, and I did the same with this. Half of this book is written in verse, and it's just a very enjoyable read with your eyes. But if you do struggle like reading poetry, I think that the audiobook is helpful for giving you the proper cadence.
We give thanks to our ancestors. Thanks for giving us life, for being alive, to feel alive, and to share this one magnificent connection to life and all living things.
Okay, so that sample is from more of the traditional linear narrative portions, which are Mrs. Death's just perspective on death, life, and time. She is death, all she sees is death. It's a very morose, I want to say, type of vibe. And then we have a character named Wolf who is Mrs. Death's scribe and writes out like her life story. I would actually be interested to hear her narrate other things, just like when I was first introduced to Elizabeth Acevedo narrating her own story, and then I found out she narrated other audiobooks. It was so cool getting to listen to her in another capacity. So I would actually be interested to listen to Selena Godin take on someone else's story. And then next up I have The Midnight Bargain by C.L. Polk. This one is narrated by Moira Quirk, and I remember reading this physically and picking up the audiobook and then not going back to the physical book because I thought the audiobook was even better. And I remember there being a lot of character names that were super unfamiliar to me, and this helped me like figure out how to pronounce them. Also, there is a bit of strange storytelling in here. Like there's a sprite in this book, and when you get to her dialogue, it's used like colons to decipher who's speaking. But I found that the audiobook helped those portions not feel distracting to me.
She browsed through literature, in history, and even in the occult sections where other patrons would eye her with disapproval, because the realm of magic was not suitable territory for a woman of a certain youth. Just thinking of her exclusion made Beatrice's scalp heat. For women, magic was the solitary pursuit of widows and crones, not for the woman whose most noble usefulness was still intact.
I'm realizing that I have an affinity for English accents. We didn't get to hear the, did I say sprite? Spirit. There's a spirit that takes over Beatrice's body. I think we got a good intro there about what's going on. There's a bargaining season where all of the people try to get into the best marriages, and when you are married then you don't have access to your magic. She wants to retain access, but she still wants certain benefits, so she gets into this interesting relationship that the spirit helps kind of make happen. It's a really interesting story overall. The characters are fantastic, and I think the narrator did a great job. This one I also believe is an Audible exclusive. That's Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. If you picked up the audiobook for The Martian and didn't enjoy it like me, it's a different narrator, don't worry. This one is voiced by Ray Porter, and it's a 16-hour audiobook. Definitely justifiable. I find that science fiction lends itself well to audio listening for me, because a lot of like facts and statistics, and especially with the way that Andy Weir writes, there's a lot of things you don't need to like pay attention to when he's running through mathematical equations and like spaceship stuff. So often I can feel myself a little bogged down with all of the numbers and all of the like equations, so listening to it is really enjoyable. I think this could have been one that got like a full dramatized audiobook for, like where we got sound effects of the ship. He does some sound effects like with his voice, and there are kind of computer voices that he does and other like creature type stuff, and it just made it a real joy to listen to.
What's 2 plus 2?
This is the computer.
Something about the question irritates me. I'm tired. I drift back to sleep. A few minutes pass, then I hear it again. What's 2 plus 2? The soft, feminine voice lacks emotion, and the pronunciation is identical to the previous time she said it. It's a computer. A computer is hassling me.
I will say that I find men's voices are easier for me to understand sped up. So I probably listened to that on like 2.5. So it feels like a bit of an ambitious one to get into. There's that. This is about a man, Ryland. He's in space and he's all alone. He finds himself on a spaceship. He's been asleep for a very long time and he needs to get home and has to do a lot of tinkering and figure out a lot of things in order to survive. Let's continue on with some ones narrated by men, just in case that's what you're looking for. I don't know. Reprieve by James Hahn Matson. I really enjoyed the audiobook for this. I'm putting in its own category. This is the only just like general fiction book that I have. I know that it gets categorized as horror or thriller. It's not. And I think that the audiobook can help give like the right tone for you for what to expect in this story. So let's listen to a bit of J.D. Jackson.
How would a baseball cap, presumably cloth, fill with blood? Wouldn't the blood just soak in? Wouldn't the cap deflate? Wouldn't there have to be a ton of blood for the cap to fill? If so, gross. She looked up. In the center of the room, her extended family, most from the DC Metro, but a few from elsewhere, mingled. They carried baked goods held upright by red and yellow napkins. Some nibbled, others devoured.
So this is a story in which the catalyst is that there's an escape room and there's all of these people who come together to try to win a prize. They all come from very different walks of life, and in the escape room, somebody gets killed. Now, the book itself is not that story. It is the story of each individual person and just their life, like things that they experienced before coming to the escape room. There's very short segments in the escape room itself. And you might say this is the type of book that would lend itself well to a full cast audiobook because there are lots of different people in here. But I actually think it's really smart to just have this one guy doing it as the book is told in third person. It just feels like this interesting overseeing voice of everybody and their activities. I just generally recommend this book, and I enjoyed the physical reading just as much. But if you're looking for a good solid narration, it has it. Next up, I think we'll find a different tone with For Your Own Good by Samantha Downing. My last couple are mystery thrillers. And this character, Teddy, has a very distinct personality, a very distinct narration style as a character. And I feel like the audiobook narrator embodied it so extremely well, and just the overly dramatic, charismatic nature that Teddy has.
Entitlement has a particular stench. Pungent, bitter, almost brutal. Teddy smells it coming. The stench blows in the door with James Ward. It oozes out of his pores, infecting his suit, his polished shoes, his ridiculously white teeth.
Just this distaste that Teddy has for every single person he encounters is so evident in the audiobook for me. He wants to help his students. He wants his students to be the best they can, and he's willing to do anything it takes in order to make that happen. Drugging them, threatening them. There's some murder involved. It's like an intentionally over the top and smug type of vibe. It's a fantastic book, and I can't imagine it being narrated by anyone else. And my last two are going to include multiple narrators. So that last one and this one were both Literally Dead Book Club picks, which is my thriller mystery book club. If you want to join, we have merch, and these were two of the favorite selections over the past couple years. So They Never Learn is narrated by Lamix Isaac and Eileen Stevens. We have two main perspectives in here. One is a professor and one is a student at the same college. It's a story of revenge. It's a story about terrible men. It's a story about a serial killer. What I find with some audiobooks when there are multiple women is you can easily like mix up each other's voices, and I'm sure the sample's only going to give us one of them, but I think they each perfectly distinguish the characters and the perspective from each other. One of them has like a more youthful tone, one of them has a more like serious professor tone, obviously, and I think they just balance each other really well.
Tyler lies back on the weight bench and starts raising and lowering the barbell in time with the music, until his rhythm slows, stutters. His fingers wrap tighter around the bar, then they spasm, and he almost lets go of the weight, dropping it on his catalog-perfect face. My breath catches. That would ruin my whole plan.
I've said it before, this is one of my top recommended thrillers. I give it 4 stars. Everybody I know gives it 4 or 5 stars. I think it's a really solid one that a lot of people enjoy. It's a very dramatic kind of persona and perspective, so it's a good audiobook. And the last one I have is The Night Swim by Megan Golden. I've talked about before that when there are books that involve podcasts, I love being able to listen to the audiobook, but not all of them do the podcast element perfectly for me, and this one is wonderful. It's narrated by Bailey Carr, January Lavoie, and Samantha Des.
I glared at him defiantly. I would not leave my mother alone that night, not even to get medical treatment for the cuts on my feet. He was about to argue the point when a garbled message came through on his patrol car radio. He squatted down so that he was at the level of my eyes and told me that he'd arrange for a nurse to come to the house as soon as possible to attend to my injured feet. I watched through the mesh of the screen door as he sped away.
So that was the voice of Bailey Carr. You can't hear, I don't know if you want to hear all of them. So in this, we're following a podcast host named Rachel. She is going to different towns to interview different people. She's following different trials, and the one she's currently at is a rape trial. The town's golden boy, who nobody thinks could be responsible. She's there to find out the truth. But while she's there, there's somebody who is following her and leaving her notes and wanting her to solve another crime that nobody will pay attention to. And obviously these things are linked together. And it's been a while since I listened to this, but I remember enjoying all of the narrators equally and thinking that they did a fantastic job at embodying their personality. It's just an interesting story, and another one that I feel like I can broadly recommend to pretty much anyone. Obviously, if you can handle the subject matter, like every single book I've ever talked about, you should be looking up trigger warnings if that's something that you need. And I do feel like maybe that's something we should encourage audiobook apps and sites to do, because you can find them on Storygraph, you can find them in reviews. Some authors, more authors are including them at, like in the opening of their books nowadays. But I think sometimes when you're listening to an audiobook, it can have a bigger impact on you, whether that's negative or positive. So I just think that's something worth thinking about. Anyway, if any of these audiobooks intrigued you, the little portion that I shared with probably not the best audio quality, let me know which ones you're interested in. On the last time I did this video, I got a ton of comments with people recommending their favorite audiobooks. So I know the comment section of that, which I'll just link down below, is full of recommendations if you're looking for some. And also, if you maybe watched that video and now you're here again, give me an audiobook that you've listened to in the last couple years that you would now recommend. What's like your latest favorite audiobook? I'd love to hear it down below. Love getting recommendations, and I will see you later. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!